on the one hand, there was this exit deal that was negotiated by the outgoing government, right? So they had a deal, and it was called the Interim Constitution. It was a temporary document. It was adopted in 1994, and it was meant to sort of govern the transition, and reflect the sort of the deal that was struck: strong property rights, strong constitutional court to enforce the strong property rights, and amnesties for those who told the truth. It was a little bit more nuanced than that. But then at that time, while they had the interim constitution, they had this whole process whereby all South Africans could write petitions to the Constitutional Assembly. So they received something like 4 million petitions from people throughout the country. They held workshops throughout the country. They went to all the villages. They went on radio. They went on television, right? There was this whole big campaign throughout the country about the Constitution. And many people participated. They submitted. They thought about their country's Constitution. And then in the end, the drafters wrote a document which really reflected what people had said. However, there was a problem, right? The document ended up being more or different from the deal that was negotiated with the Nationalist Party that was going to give up its power, right? So how were they going to reconcile that? And the solution that they chose was to put the Constitutional Court in charge of making sure that the new Constitution did not violate the deal that was struck, right? So some part of the Constitution, the new Constitution that was drafted by all the people, were being held unconstitutional. Because the court was tasked to say, okay, we had to, part of this transition of power, everybody knew, meant we had to protect the interest of the Nationalist Party, otherwise they would never leave, right? But they also wanted an inclusive process. So this was basically their way to have it both ways, right? And it meant probably that the constitutional property protections became stronger than most people wanted. But people understood, right? We have to give these people, the outgoing party something, otherwise they're not gonna do it. So that's sort of one example of how votes were done. Do you have a question? Yeah, I thought you were raising. An earthquake? Should we leave the room? No. You tell me. Okay.
Barbie delusion, sorry.
Well, there was an earthquake recently, so just a few days ago. Well, tell me if don't feel, get up if you feel you should get up. Please. Okay. So, are there any questions at this point about any of this? Or?
Yes, sir. Professor, you said there are 3 ways to change sorry. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, you just give 3 examples to change the constitution: when amending, 2 starting over again, 3 sorry, making a new copy, or amending, or something. The third one is I just forget.
Through judicial interpretation.
Sorry.
The court.
Through judicial, through the court.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that you have learned most about most details of our constitution, Myanmar. So how should we be change? Sorry, how should we change this through control, through writing a new copy or something like that? So we need an opinion.
Okay, I can give an opinion. So I think in the case of Myanmar, all 3 are possible, except amendment is really hard, right? Because we know that the military effectively needs to be on board for there to be an amendment. So that has made amendment particularly difficult. Right? But technically, if let's say everybody agrees there has to be an amendment to have a federal system, then I can conceivably see that the Constitution could be amended. Right? But it depends on different players and whether you get that supermajority. I always find, and whether something is hard or easy to change is not always easy to say, right? So one example of a constitution that's impossible to amend is the Constitution of Japan. Has never been amended. Japan's constitution is highly illegitimate. You know who wrote it? The Americans. General MacArthur wrote the Japanese constitution after World War II in a week. A team of American lawyers drafted it. And they said it is 2/3 majority in 2 subsequent sessions and a referendum. Turns out in Japan it's impossible to get a 2/3 majority in parliament. It just doesn't happen. So they never changed it, right? But the Americans who drafted the Constitution, you know where they found that provision on the 2/3 majority in 2 subsequent parliaments? They didn't know that much about it, right? Alabama and many state constitutions had exactly that provision. So it's a very common provision, 2/3 majority of 2 subsequent legislatures and a popular referendum. You know what the most amended constitution in the world is? Alabama's. It's actually 400,000 words long as well. It's also the longest constitution in the world. It's twice the size of Moby Dick. It's a very long constitution. So whether or not something is easy or hard to change depends on who holds the seats in parliament and what their negotiating position is, right? So if the military says there's not going to be an amendment, there's probably not going to be an amendment, right? If they want to, then that's a way of doing it. You can imagine taking Chile's route of gradually becoming a little bit more democratic and more democratic and more democratic as time goes on, right? Assuming you can negotiate that. Another way is, so it's my understanding that the Constitution of Myanmar does not say that it cannot, it says nothing about replacement, which is true for many countries' constitutions. You know what happens? They get replaced anyway. But it requires something like a claim of we are now in a more legitimate constitutional moment than the Constitution itself. We are asserting ourselves as a constituent power, right? Not just ordinary democratic policy, but a special moment of constituent power when we're writing a new constitution. It usually requires you not just to have a majority, but to have a constitutional assembly that is democratic, that decides by majority, where people are not systematically excluded, including minorities, right? It's an inclusive moment. And at that point, it's hard to say that moment, that assembly cannot write the Constitution, right? But it's hard. It always is a little bit revolutionary, right? And it may not, it's not easy to get to that moment. And I can't advise you that that's the right way to go, but I know that this has happened a lot in other countries. That's what I can say. The third way of doing this is also possible, right? I mean, assuming there were a constitutional tribunal that actually heard cases. And I just yesterday had talked to a judge from the Constitutional Tribunal, and they have 0 cases. Right? It's technically possible that the Constitutional Court will play an important role. I mean, it's my opinion as a lawyer, and I read the Constitution of Myanmar, that there is enough ambiguity for it to accommodate change. Right? There is a lot of provisions on federalism, for example, as it is. They're not great, but they're also very vague. So there's a lot of room for a court. And if you, let's say, took the Indian Supreme Court and put it here, right? It could do a lot with the Constitution. But of course, that requires you to establish a court. I mean, one of the problems I think with the current court is it's really hard to bring cases to court, right? Including for state parliaments. I mean, state parliaments, under the Constitution, they can bring cases. But then the law on the Constitutional Tribunal says it has to go through the president, which makes it more difficult. And it's not necessary. Because, I mean, me reading that law is like, that's not in the Constitution. It's more restrictive than the Constitution is, right? So maybe you can imagine a world where, I mean, of course, I can't suddenly imagine a tribunal that is independent, that doesn't currently exist. But if it were one, that is also a way through which countries change their constitution. illegitimate and not so great documents that are hard to change, they can still accommodate a certain amount of change within them sometimes, like in Japan. Right? The Japanese are still working with the document that was written by the Americans. Any other
I have a question. It is a stupid question. In our constitution, for constitutional tribunal, it can overrule the constitution or the tribunal have power to change some case and which cannot be amendable in our constitution about the proportion of the military seat. So for this case, the constitutional tribunal, do they have power? I mean, our constitution, does it give this tribunal court power to overrule something from the constitution?
That would be hard, right? It's hard for courts to go directly against the text. It helps when the text is unclear, right? So they can do a lot when the text is unclear, right? Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that you can't have a vice chancellor, right? And you can pass a law and it's still okay within the constitutional framework, right? So you can imagine the court doing things like that, or talking more of the powers of federalism. Schedule 2 of the Constitution is fairly vague. So the court can work with that, but it's hard to go against explicit rules. I mean, courts have done it, but they're very vulnerable when they do so, right? Because then, it's that is difficult. Yeah. There was a question.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the question of how a constitution came into force. So, for example, I mean, as far as I understand, in the American Constitution, the written document of principles like separation of powers, check and balance, limiting the government power, and all these are written as a principle, and and also establishing ideal political institution like this. But in what I study in Myanmar Constitution, the military is only forced to protect the Constitution. But I don't see any other political institution that can, using principle from the Constitution into force. So sometimes I see some kinds of abuses or some kinds of constitutional problems, but there is no other political institution, mechanism or state apparatus to make it correct.
To implement.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so let's talk about that topic a little bit, and I'm gonna ask Kevin to chip in on it a little bit too. So enforcing constitutions is really difficult, right? Assuming you had a great constitution, right, which has all the rights in the world, has a democratic checks and balances, a democratic parliament, right? It's still hard to enforce it, especially the rights provisions. Why is it difficult? Well, constitutions tell governments to do certain things and not do certain things. And it turns out governments have, they have the military usually, or they have the power, they have more force and more powerful than the people that they are supposed to protect, right? So it's really hard to get the government to comply with its obligations that are in the Constitution, right? So the Constitution of Myanmar, actually, the 2008 Constitution, has a lot of constitutional rights provisions. But if my rights are violated, there's not a lot of places I can go to make a claim along those lines, right? But this is a common problem in many countries of the world. It's even with a strong court, how are you going to enforce the document? I mean, one way that people think about constitutions is as a social contract, right? It's maybe the best way to think about the Constitution, or at least about a democratic constitution. It's a contract between the people of the country and their government. And they say, we're going to give you some of these powers, but in return, you need to do certain things. You need to protect our rights. You need to make sure we have healthcare, education, so on, right? Social rights. But also we have certain negative liberty rights that you cannot infringe upon. We all have a freedom of religion, and the government can't, mess with that. Or the government cannot torture people, right? There are certain things that the government cannot do, and other things that it must do. And it's a contract between the government and the people. Except the government is much more powerful than the people. right? So it's hard. So one answer to this problem is, well, what if you have a court, right? The court can tell the government you cannot do this, right? You try to torture somebody, no, this is unconstitutional. But the problem is, courts can be ignored too, right? I just studied Poland, which was a really strong democracy, until they had a new government in power that decided that it was going to violate people's rights and also that it didn't want the court anymore. It started to ignore the court. Let me give you another example. President Donald Trump, United States of America, he had this proposal to enact a travel ban, right? Let me give another example. He had even a worse proposal. Well, it's hard to, anyway. He had a proposal during his campaign that he would have a registry of Muslims. All Muslims in the countries would have their registry. That proposal is clearly unconstitutional, right? It's clearly a violation of the Constitution. But he proposed it anyway. Okay? Imagine, and he's kind of crazy, sorry to say, but imagine he would actually try to implement this proposal, right? What would happen? Well, the courts would say, no, you cannot do it, right? Like they did with his travel ban, they said you cannot do it. It's not that hard to imagine Trump then saying, well, but, I'm the president, the court is not elected, I'm going to do this, this is what the people want, right? He's just going to ignore the court. What is going to happen then? Any questions? What may happen? What if you ignore the court?
Some argument, no court.
Yeah.
Check out Bella.
Is it shaking again?
He was not.
Okay.
I think he maybe retained it from his power.
Yeah. Maybe, right? So one thing that's happened is Americans are going to get really, really angry across the board, right? They're probably going to be marching in the street demanding their constitutional rights. It's probably going to happen, right?
Can I suggest what else will happen?
Go for it.
So no, that will never come to that because nobody would agree in his administration to enforce that. If he ordered the Attorney General to create a registry, the Attorney General would refuse. And if he were fired, he'd appoint somebody else, and that person would refuse. Because nobody would be willing to sacrifice their entire career and their entire reputation to implement this clearly unconstitutional rule. And because the Constitution is so much of what some would call a civic religion, it's almost a religion to Americans, although not religious, but government-oriented. So this would be like breaking, God's highest law. And so the fallout, the damage to the reputation, that person would go down in the history books as their reputation would be ruined forever. And so I don't think it would ever come to that because Trump may be in favor of it, but nobody else did. When he proposed this, even all of his supporters, or not his voters, but his elected supporters, his allies in Congress, of his own parties, they said, no, that's a horrible idea. America is about equal opportunity for all. We don't support or favor any one religion. So it was universally condemned. And so if he did something like that, it would never happen. So you may have one crazy tyrant or one unstable person who's willing to take that step, but unless there's a whole group of them and they have power, it's not going to happen. Assuming that the order or the decision is truly, clearly unconstitutional and not more of a gray area.
Well, and so here actually, this is what he's describing as truly rule of law, right? Or rule of constitutional law, meaning people just will just not break the rules set by the constitutions. Kevin and I, we actually disagree on this a little bit. So having studied Poland and Turkey and other places, I'm a little more skeptical that something like that would never happen in the United States. But Americans, they're really confident. Whenever I talk to an American, they're like, not in our country, right? The Constitution matters a lot. But it's not obvious. We know in many parts of the world, presidents ignore the Constitution and they get away with it, especially if the proposal is popular, right? If people want to violate rights, who's going to stand up and defend the Constitution?
And I don't think we disagree. I think that clearly does happen in many places, but there are other places where it doesn't happen. So we know what happened in the case of Trump. And although he didn't propose a Muslim registry, I'm pretty sure later he denied that he ever actually proposed it, even though he was on videotape proposing it. But what he did is propose this harsh ban on travel from 7 countries, and those countries were predominantly Muslim. But there were many other countries like Indonesia and Saudi Arabia that weren't included, that were predominantly Muslim. So he proposed this ban from certain countries, and it was immediately challenged in court. And he had a long history of attacking the courts, of calling them illegitimate. There was a judge of Mexican descent who had ruled against him in a fraud case. And he said that he was illegitimate because he was Mexican and so forth. So he has a long history of attacking the courts. And the courts ruled against him. And he immediately went to Twitter and said, this is illegitimate, our courts are terrible. And then what did he do? Did he say, I'm ignoring it, I'm going to do it anyway? No, he said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to appeal this to the highest court in the country. We'll see what they have to say. Even Donald Trump deferred to the courts. It was unthinkable that he would say anything else.
For now. But yeah, we have slightly different.
Well, I held against him several times.
Yeah, so enforcing constitutional rights, even if you have a good constitution and you're a democracy, full democracy, it's not easy, right? And what does the research on this suggest, and I've been researching this question myself, is the most effective way to enforce constitutional rights. It requires civil society mobilization, right? Constitutional rights don't enforce themselves. You somehow need to make it costly for a government to violate rights. And how do you make it costly? It's like when newspapers are talking about it, when talk shows are talking about it, when civil society gets people to protest about it, right? When people say, we will not vote for you in the next election, when we will bring cases to court, right? That's the kind of stuff that needs to happen for constitutional rights to make a difference, right? For that, to implement those provisions. You need to, it's not just true for constitutional rights, it's also true for federalism, for example. If I read the Constitution of Myanmar and the Schedule 2 and the provisions on federalism, there's some, albeit imperfect, but there is some federalism in there, right? But it's not really implemented. So what you can imagine a case where the state parliaments or regional parliaments are going to bring their case to the Constitutional Court and say, hey, we have these powers, right? And sometimes they win, sometimes they lose, but they need to be able to contest it and make those cases. Without it, it's not really, it's not going to happen because constitutions don't enforce themselves, right? You're political scientists, the result of anybody with power likes to keep it and make it larger, right? So you need to, you need to have other institutions that are also given power, and they need to fight with each other, right? They need to have constant battles over who gets certain powers. And what the Constitution does is it sort of facilitates those battles. It means we don't have to go pick up our arms. It means we have a forum where we can fight our battles, right? And the forum could be a constitutional court. It could be in parliament, right? If there is certain representation of these groups that also have powers, they can fight their case in parliament. And maybe because the president can veto and then parliament can overrule the veto and then the court can strike it all down, right? But there's always different institutions with power that fight each other, right? And the people as a whole also have some power. It's hard for people to organize themselves, but that's what civil society does, right? It has certain powers and it tries to defend it, but you need a place to fight these battles, and a good constitution helps you fight these battles, right? It's never perfect, it's always messy. Even though the Muslim registry didn't happen, the US doesn't have a perfect track record, right? There's been cases where the Constitution has been ignored. Think about the internments of the Japanese during World War II, and then the court says it was actually okay, although now it's pretty clear that it wasn't, but it was a time of emergency, for example.
The court said, through complex legal reasoning, why it was okay.
Yes.
So we can debate whether the court, a majority, it was split. So whether a majority believed that that was genuinely permissible given the circumstances, or whether they were just succumbing to the president and to the notion that it might undermine, it might hurt the war effort if they did otherwise. But it wasn't that they said, we know the Constitution doesn't allow this, but we're going to do it anyway. They said no, through 50-page opinion of complex statutory and case law analysis over 150 years, they concluded reluctantly that under these circumstances, yes, the Constitution does allow it.
Yeah, that is true.
And
Although
that's widely regarded as a mistake and wrong now, and it was attacked at the time, but opinion was more split.
I'll take some questions. Yes.
Okay. Actually, I have some of the speech or maybe saying from many people and also the politicians. If you really want to know each country current situation or some other field, we have better observe about the constitution so that we can able to predict the country very well. But however, on the other hand, there are some countries who don't have the constitution, like the United Kingdom, written constitution. So in that situation, how could we really know that the rule of the constitution?
Yeah. So the UK is really weird. I wrote my dissertation in the UK, and I studied with constitutional law professors in Oxford, and 4 years later, I still don't understand the UK Constitution. It's highly unusual, right? So the UK Constitution exists of conventions. So, and they are constitutional in nature, meaning they have to be followed, but they emerged over a very long period of time. For most countries, the UK model is not really an option. Why? Because you need hundreds of years of practice to get there, right? And to recognize that some of these are constitutional. And the courts have recognized that some statutes have a constitutional status, like Magna Carta is only an ordinary statute, but nobody's going to say, oh, let's repeal Magna Carta, right? It's just not going to happen. So one way of thinking about constitution, one thing they do, if you're at a moment you're writing a constitution, especially in a democratic transition or some moment of change, you want some clear guidance on what is the government. So think of this social contract, right? We're going to empower this government, and we're going to give it certain powers, but we need to be pretty clear. How many members are there going to be in parliament, right? If you don't say that, it's going to be chaos, right? You probably need to write it down. How many people are going to be president? One. Most countries have one. But Bosnia-Herzegovina has three, right? Nowhere does it say you can have three presidents. You can have more than one. But you need to make that clear. If you don't clarify that, it's going to be a mess, right? So, and in the UK, they took a long time to figure this out, and they got there without writing it down. But in most cases, you need to write it down. You need to coordinate, right? The same with the Bill of Rights. It makes clear what the government can or cannot do, right? And the fact that it's written, and maybe this is because I'm a lawyer, but I think the fact that it's written matters to some extent, because let's say government passes a bill that is clearly, well, that people really don't like because it takes away people's freedom of expression, right? Then you can say, look at the Constitution and say, we have a right to free speech, and it's written here. That in and of itself may matter as a sort of focal point around which you can coordinate and say this is a violation of our rights, right? It may even be better if you can go to court, because then the court will further say this is a violation of the right. And it becomes increasingly hard for the government to ignore it. I mean, they may, but it is costly, right? It costs them politically. That's what you need for a constitution to work. There need to be political cost to ignoring it. And that's what it takes. More questions, yeah, and then we'll take it.
So you mentioned briefly the Bill of Rights. I wanted to know in your research how many constitutions you have observed that have entrenched the Universal Declaration of Human Rights directly
directly the Declaration of Human Rights voted by the United Nations inside the Constitution are their Charter of Rights. Is that the current thing in the new process of writing the Constitution?
The thing that's increasingly common is to entrance the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the international, and maybe also the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. So Kevin will talk about this more in a moment. But the Universal Declaration on Human Rights is not a treaty, right? It's part of the UN Charter. It's a declaration. However, many people have said it's customary international law, and countries are bound by it even if they haven't ratified the ICCPR. I mean, this is an argument that applies to Myanmar in the sense that even if the country has not ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it's still bound as a matter of custom by the basic rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because there's more than one source of international law, and one is custom. But it's increasingly common for countries, especially in Latin America, this is a really big trend, to include human rights treaties in the Constitution and to say they're equal to our Constitution. And what is interesting about that, it means that the jurisprudence or the cases on what these rights mean are decided by the Human Rights Committee and not the domestic court, right? Because they come with it. So there is a certain sense that if you maybe are a little bit distrustful of your own court or worried that it may be captured by political interest, then it's a better pre-commitment to include these international treaties. So that is a really big trend. Universal Declaration, because it's not a treaty, it's often just mentioned in the preamble in a much more less legally binding way.
It was sort of the starting point in many ways for the ICCPR, ICSCR, right? It contains both positive rights that the government has to provide you, and negative rights, things the government can't do to you. And so that became the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights for the positive rights, the National Covenant on Civil and Political Rights for the negative rights. So there are some similarities.
I was really envious when I first read Russell Harding's Liberalism, Constitutionalism, and Democracy, in that he argued that he envisioned the Constitution not as a traditional from the contrarian lens, but he interpreted the Constitution as the Constitution as the process of coordination. And he recalled the Philadelphia Convention as the attempt to coordinate the most significant interests of the elites. So the elitists, though it is elitist, and though I don't want to admit myself that it is fragmented, and it is what we are increasingly seeing in what happened in the constitution making after, especially in the transition, democratic transition country. That's why I want your help to reconcile, because it is, we cannot reject his idea of the constitution as a coordination paper, right? So that's why what I want to ask from you as a help is how we can reconcile his idea of coordination. Because if the elites in the constitutional conventions are projecting their own interests to be coordinated, and then apparently they are not behind the veil of ignorance, and it is also against the essence of deliberative democracy. So if you have any advice to reconcile the coordination perspective with veil of ignorance and the deliberative democracy.
And social contract.
Sure.
So Russell, yeah, that's a very important question, right? So one of the theories he's referring to is constitutions, and I was just mentioning this, constitutions, they coordinate, right? They help, it's like drive a sign that says whether you have to drive on the left side of the road or the right side of the road. We don't really care which side, but we have to pick, right? And we need to settle some rules because otherwise it's going to be chaos. my example of how many members of parliament to elect, how many presidents, are all coordination stuff. And as a coordination device, constitutions are incredibly important, right? They're sort of the rule of the game, if you want. I think the Burmese constitution of 2008 it coordinates, right? We can say what we want, and we may or may not like it, right? But it definitely is. It's the rules of the game. This is how things should be working, and there is right. And I think Harden says there's no such thing as a good constitution. He also says, I met him in Oxford. He was very old at the time. He's passed away since. But he would always lecture over dinner or at conference dinners. He'd say, never use the word legitimacy. Why never use the word legitimacy? But he believed in this. Is sort of, there's no such thing as a good constitution. There's a constitution that works, and there's a constitution that doesn't work. I have a feeling that if I ask him, what do you think of the Burmese constitution? He probably says it works. It may not be good, right? But that's a different question. The question is, does it do what it says it's doing? And I mean, I would say partially, right? Because there's a lot of things in there, like rights provisions that are not necessarily respected, or federalism provisions that could be better improved, right? But in a large part, it does what it says it's doing. But a normative philosopher will come along and say, hey, it's a terrible document, right? Which is true for many constitutions, right? They may coordinate. They say, the U.S. Constitution, it works, right? There's no social rights, no social justice provision, no education rights, no healthcare rights, right? A normative philosopher may look at the U.S. Constitution and say, hey, it's a terrible document, but it works. So that we can have a long conversation about this. So maybe I want to talk a little bit about the topic that you mentioned, and I would also ask Kevin about this. It's whether to have a Supreme Court or a constitutional court, right? So this is often a debate for a country that is a new democracy. Many countries that become democratic, there is a question of, okay, we have a constitution. We want the court to enforce the constitution. What kind of court is going to have the power to do this, right? And so one model is to have a specialized constitutional court or a constitutional tribunal that only has the power to do judicial review work. And when I say judicial review, I mean the following. It means if there is a law that contradicts the Constitution, or if there's regulations that contradicts the Constitution, or even executive action of any type that contradicts the Constitution, it should be held unconstitutional. Meaning it's illegal, it's not valid, it's not law, right? Because the Constitution is the highest law of the land, and any laws that contradict the Constitution are unconstitutional.
Sorry, do you want to continue this after break right now, or?
Oh. So you guys tell me. You guys tell me. You want a break? Yes. Okay, great. We'll talk about this after break.
All right, 10 minutes?
10 minutes, yes.
Come back at 3:40.
Stay closer to the microphone for the interpreter. So sorry about that earlier. Am I the only one who's cold, or?